SeanBell is a retired Royal Air Force pilot and Sky News military analyst. Welcome to our program, Sean.
Daniel, it's always a pleasure to join you.
Ukraine has hit 4 Russia's strategic aviation airfields, destroying at least 13 Russia's strategic nuclear-capable bombers. What is your reaction to this operation as your former Royal Air Force pilot?
I think this is a really good example of where Ukrainian planning and deception has been proven absolutely invaluable. The Russians thought that some of their strategic assets were within range of some of Ukraine's long-range missiles, so they moved them away to bases across Russia, some of them thousands of miles away from Ukraine, yet Ukraine managed to conduct a covert drone attack. It was not what the Russians were expecting. And I think, first of all, it was audacious. Secondly, it's hit quite a lot of aircraft. You said destroyed 13. There's reports of up to 41 that have been damaged. And it is worth remembering some of these aircraft fell out of production some years ago. So getting spares for them is not very easy at all. And the other thing to point out is that when Russia moved its aircraft away to get them away from Ukraine's strikes, it can only move the serviceable aeroplanes. Now, in the Royal Air Force, my Air Force, we only really had about a third of your fleet that were available to fly at any one time, and therefore 2/3 will still be being serviced or repaired or basically being stripped for spares. Russia is infamous for not having a lot of spares and having to cannibalize, tear apart older aircraft. So what this means is that the aircraft that flew away was probably the vast majority of Russia's serviceable bomber fleet. And therefore, the actions to take out these bears, the backfires, and these mainstay, which are command and control aircraft, could well have inflicted a much more serious blow than at first we imagined it was.
And also, what does this mean for Vladimir Putin? Do you feel that he has been humiliated, as he has been saying that he's so-called Mr. Security for Russia, but after he decided to begin this full-scale war against Ukraine, 1/3 of Russia's strategic aviation has been destroyed?
I have no doubt that President Putin will be embarrassed and will be very frustrated and angry that so many of these aircraft were destroyed, because it isn't just about the war in Ukraine. These aircraft are also part of Russia's strategic force to power around the world. Here in the United Kingdom, we have a quick reaction alert, fighters on 24 hours a day alert, both in the north of Scotland, up at Lossiemouth, and also at Coningsby. And they regularly intercept Russian bears that are testing NATO's defences around the north of NATO. And therefore, any loss of these aircraft means that Russia is less able to demonstrate its prowess around the world, and that will have a major impact on President Putin's standing in the world. And unfortunately, with these aircraft, you can't just nip down to the supermarket and replace them. I believe some of them, the Bears, for example, they came into service before I was born, which is a long time ago, but they've also went out of service some years ago, and therefore there is no quick fix for Vladimir Putin to get fleet bolstered again, and that will have an implication not only for the war in Ukraine, but also Russia's ability to project power around the world.
From your perspective, what are the current options for Russia's Air Force to try to save the aircraft which were not destroyed by the Ukrainian drones? Will they try to redeploy far away from the front lines, more deep inside Russia, or would they also redeploy air defense systems and will try to defend current planes which are located inside Russia?
I think Russia is going to be faced with a bit of a challenge because, bluntly, these aircraft, these strategically important bombers, were located well away from Ukrainian long-range missiles. It does look likely that the Ukrainian strike involved drones operating from just outside the airfield, an amazingly brave, courageous act by the Ukrainian forces involved. And it's very difficult to see how you can protect against those sorts of attacks unless you put these bombers into hardened aircraft shelters or into hangars where the drones can't get at them. One of the reasons that President Vladimir Putin would have redeployed these aircraft away was to get them away from missile threat, but it's very likely that there weren't the hangars available in this new location. So that Russia has to do some pretty quick thinking, first of all, to up its defenses around all of its strategic aviation assets. That will be a major distraction from his efforts on the front line. But also, he's going to be worried about where he's going to be hit next. Up till now, Ukrainian drone activity in Russia has largely been striking the sort of oil infrastructure, some defense industrial base. All of that is irritating for Putin, but basically recoverable from. This strike was audacious, but has made a lasting impression, and have no doubt at all this will directly impact Russia's ability to launch cruise missiles and deliver bombs on the front line in the war in Ukraine.
Do you feel that such secret operations deep inside Russia could become another center of gravity in this war if Ukraine continues to attack Russia's bombers, Russian airfields deep inside Russia? Could this force Vladimir Putin to make any kind of concessions to Ukraine? Could this force Putin to end his war, or at least change his calculus in this war?
Yes, I think we've got to be careful using terms like centers of gravity. Centers of gravity from a purely academic perspective in my warfighting time were something so crucial to your enemy that if you managed to remove it or destroy it, then he would be in big trouble. I'm not sure the strategic bomber force is a center of gravity for President Putin. He has a number of other ways to deliver weapons on the front line. It undoubtedly will have an impact, but not really a strategic center of gravity. I think a center of gravity might be Putin's ability to fund the war and also public support for the war. And I think those things are something that President Putin will undoubtedly be trying very carefully to preserve those. So in answer to your question, I don't think these strikes are going to bring the war to an end, but I do think it's undoubtedly these will have hurt Russia. They will have hurt President Putin. His anger was evident when he launched a tirade of attacks across the whole of Ukraine. Whilst that was damaging, it wasn't actually furthering his war aims at all, but was largely an act of anger and frustration at Ukraine's success.
Also, Ukraine has struck the Kerch Bridge for the third time using underwater explosions, and also secret agents tried to destroy this bridge for another time. What is your assessment of these operations regarding the Kerch Bridge, and how could this influence the outcome of this war?
Yes, the Kerch Bridge is a really interesting case study because when Ukraine exploded that lorry load of explosives in the bridge, that caused devastating impact, closed the bridge for some time. But of course, so at that moment, it was tactically a very important strike. The strategic impact was that Russia therefore stepped up its protection of that bridge because it knew it was going to be targeted. And now it's proving a lot more difficult for Ukraine to strike the bridge. It is a vital arterial link between Russia and Crimea, and therefore also a quite legitimate target. But the most recent attacks, which were sort of underwater on one of the main supports for the bridge, don't appear to have been effective at taking down the bridge. They were undoubtedly a surprise for Russia. So I think the earlier attack with a lorry exploding in the middle of the bridge was far more effective than this latest attack. What it does do is reminds Russia that it has to look after the bridge. But frankly, unless Ukraine takes the bridge down and coordinates that with other action, I don't think it'll have much impact on the war.
Let's also cover my final question in this regarding this topic of the war in Ukraine. U.S. President Trump's stance on Ukraine. U.S. President Donald Trump had another phone call with Vladimir Putin. Putin congratulated him on his birthday. How can you assess this endless phone calls between Trump and Putin without any kind of significant result? Do you feel that Trump has been played by Vladimir Putin for so many weeks, and do you expect any kind of sanctions against Russia from the US government?
I've a lot of time on media. I've been asked this question, and I've spoken to a lot of my American colleagues, particularly former military colleagues. Their perspective on this is that most political leaders operate with a sort of core intent. What is their belief system? And he said it's pretty clear that President Trump wants to see an end to the war. He hates the dying. He wants to find a way to end the war. And of course, his natural default setting is to negotiate. And therefore, you can only negotiate if you find a way of sitting around the table. So what he's trying to do is create a set of circumstances where he and President Putin can sit around the table and come to some sort of agreement. Where, as a former military guy, it's pretty clear is that you can only stop these conflicts with either a carrot or a stick. In other words, you either incentivize President Putin that he realizes that it's much greater benefit in stopping the war than it is continuing it, and to date, it feels very unlikely that there's anything that anybody can offer that will stop him fighting this war. The question is what his final objectives are. So then you go back to Trump and say, well, okay, if he won't accept a carrot, what is the stick option? How can you force President Putin to the table? For example, if America was to put a 50% sanction on any country buying Russian oil, whether it's via India or whoever, that almost certainly would drop the demand for Russian oil very quickly and dry up Russia's ability to fund the war. But so far, we've not seen America have an appetite for that, because President Putin keeps telling Trump that he's definitely up for peace. It's just a matter of timing, and it's Ukraine's fault. But it's pretty clear that as time goes on, President Trump is getting more and more frustrated, and I think there is a NATO summit happening in The Hague, I think later on this month, in about a week's time, and that it'll be telling to see what message that Trump is broadcasting, and also the influence of other NATO colleagues who will clearly be trying to persuade him that Putin is stringing him along, and actually he needs to go much firmer if he's to bring this war to an end.
Also, in our latest discussion, you said that also military options for the U.S. president would be the best decision to force Putin to make any kind of concessions. Do you still believe that the U.S. could consider any kind of military options regarding Ukraine? Because U.S. Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth says that the U.S. is reducing military aid for Ukraine.
I think it's an interesting question, Daniel, but I think there's two parts to this. It sounds like you're asking me whether America would get involved militarily in Ukraine. I don't see that as likely. It is pretty clear that President Trump does not want to get America involved in long, drawn-out wars overseas. So the question then becomes is to Europe maybe providing a lot of financial support to Ukraine, but bluntly, Ukraine needs weapons, and the main provider of weapons has to date been America. And therefore, if America was to slow down the supply of weapons or even walk away, it will be very difficult for Europe to step up. And I think that's where the main focus from European allies will be is just reminding Trump that actually without weapons, Ukraine will be more vulnerable. A more vulnerable Ukraine is a more vulnerable Europe, and therefore President Putin will probably feel emboldened. That's a more dangerous world. That's not a world in which President Trump wants to be involved in. And therefore, what can America do to step up its military support to Ukraine and provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs to prevail? But let's be clear here, because I've got to be quite careful as a military guy. You and I have talked over the last months and years. I understand fully why Ukraine would want to reclaim all of its land and Crimea. But I think there's a view in America, particularly with Donald Trump, that actually the days of that ambition are over, not at least for now. And therefore, Trump does not want to be perpetuating a war. He wants to force both sides to come to an agreement, which would probably include ceding some territory. That's a very uncomfortable position for not only Ukraine to be, but also the whole of Europe. Because if you reward President Putin for his actions, for his aggressive action, where does that lead?
And also, it seems like European allies who have been discussing this idea of deploying troops to Ukraine not only have rejected this idea, but it seems like they have put this idea away because the US didn't commit to support such mission. Do you feel that this idea of deploying European troops to Ukraine is still on the table?
Daniel, I would never take anything off the table. I think at its heart, European leaders do believe that if Ukraine was to fall, that would have huge implications for European security. And therefore, what is the point in helping Ukraine with weapons just to survive if it doesn't provide enough to help Ukraine win, or at least end the war? And therefore, whilst there is no appetite at the moment for European countries to put troops on the ground, the casualties that Ukraine is suffering, there is no appetite in the West at all for sending soldiers to that sort of meat grinder of battle. But I do think that there is more and more talk in some of the offices now about what can be done rather than what can't be done. And I think the air shield over Ukraine, the Sky Shield, I think the initiative was called. There is a lot more thought now around what some form of no-fly zone might look like, provided by Western allies, not necessarily over the whole country, but potentially over parts of Ukraine. How could that help defend Ukraine better and potentially therefore free up assets from Ukraine to put closer to the front line? Again, this isn't happening tomorrow, but I do sense there's a growing appetite in Europe to work out what can be done to try to stop the relentless advance of President Putin on the front line.
Let's also cover the situation in the Middle East. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that the Iranian regime could fall because this regime is really weak right now, and regime change could be the result of the Israeli operation against the Iranian regime. How can you assess the current situation in this air battle between Israel and Iran, and how can you assess the effectiveness of missile strikes and drone strikes by both Israel and Iran?
Yeah, there's a lot in that question, Daniel. Let's take the sort of first bit first, regime change. I'm not entirely sure as a military guy that air power can lead to regime change. And besides, that really wasn't the main effort of this strike. You have to go back a few years. Most military analysts believe that this day would eventually come because Israel sees Iran as an existential threat. Iran with a nuclear weapon would create an unthinkable future for Israel. Therefore, Iran had to be stopped, at least in Israel's eyes, from ever getting a nuclear weapon. The international community has been adding its weight behind that, but has only used diplomatic means. And I think Israel had concluded that Iran was just going about its business and was getting closer and closer to the inevitable day. So Israel felt that now was as good a time as any, and undoubtedly they've been planning this operation for years. They knew this day would come, and they've therefore worked out exactly how they were going to do it. And I think the plan has been fantastically well executed from a military perspective. We've just been talking about your Ukrainian drone attack against the Russian bomber forces. That took a lot of time and planning and was very effective. I think we've seen exactly the same thing with Israeli strikes on Iran. First of all, keeping it secret so that they could strike the people first, the scientists, because without the scientists, the nuclear program would struggle. Then start to roll back the Iranian air defense systems, which was not just done with missiles, was also done with their Mossad forces using drones within Iranian territory. And then once they roll back, and you've now got their Israeli F-35s operating with impunity, Israel's got air superiority all the way across western Iran, all the way up to Tehran, and now are operating with impunity. And it's a little bit like you being in Kyiv with the Russian jets operating freely overhead at the moment. Even though Russia's got an upper hand, they don't have that luxury. So Iran has been exposed. The nuclear program is the number one priority. Although Benjamin Netanyahu is hinting at regime change, let's not lose sight of the fact that the main aim of this is to actually degrade and ultimately destroy Iran's fledgling nuclear capability.
Is Israel capable of fully destroying Iranian nuclear program without the support and without the involvement of the United States?
Israel's probably the dominant military power in the region, and I have little doubt that America would not want to be directly involved in any attack on Iran. That would have all sorts of consequences, and therefore Israel would manage. The challenge that Israel's got is that there is one of the bases in Iran, name escapes me at the moment, but there are several nuclear sites, but one of them is buried deep underground. The Israelis have bunker busters, GBU-28s. They are 5,000-pound bombs. That's 5 times the size of the 1,000-pound bombs that I used to fly with in the military. They're designed specifically. They're slightly sleeker than a normal bomb. They've got a special penetrator head on them to get them deep underground before they explode, with a special delay on the timing fuse as well. And they can go through about 30 meters of dirt and about 8 to 10 meters of concrete. But that's not enough to get into some of these deep underground bunkers where some of the nuclear facilities lie. Now, Israel could just keep pounding away at the same hole, making the crater bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually almost drill down to the facilities below. But the one bomb that probably will make life easier is the 30,000-pound mother of all bombs. It's called the MOP in reality, Massive Ordnance Penetrator. That's 30,000 pounds of high explosive. It's only the America that's got these. The trouble is those bombs weigh more than many military fast jets anyway. So the only aircraft that can use it is the B-2 Spirit bomber, the very expensive, very capable American bomber. So if it was to be used, it would have to come from an American bomber that would directly involve America in the fight. And I think that's why we saw yesterday President Trump spend well over an hour with his advisors talking about options. Do they want to get directly involved? Do they want to stop Iran getting the nuclear bomb, which is something President Trump has talked directly about? But of course, if they were to attack Iran directly, a lot of US and UK military bases are certainly within range of the Iranian weapon systems. And that's something that I think President Trump will be very mindful of.
You just mentioned about Trump's meeting with his national security team. According to Axios, Trump is considering joining the war against Iran and participating in this operation to obliterate Iranian nuclear program. From your perspective, what are the chances that the US would finally join Israel in destroying these nuclear sites, and do you believe that Iran could retaliate not only against American military bases, but also against the United States continental territory?
Yeah, it's a huge question, and the honest answer is we just don't know, Daniel. If you look at the first of all, if I look at this grand strategically, Iran will have been surprised at just how easily that Israel was able to defeat its air defense systems and operate with impunity fighter jets over the top of Iran. That is very scary for the population of Iran, and it leaves Iran horribly exposed and vulnerable. At times like this, the last thing that Iran will want is to pick a fight with America, the global superpower, that will then make life significantly more difficult for the leadership. And as a result of that, I expect there'll be a lot of bluster from Iran, but whether they actually want to drag America into this fight, I don't know. I think it's unlikely, but who knows what the regime, the Ayatollah, would do if pushed. The question, I think, is that if it's only because of one bomb and one facility, is that a risk worth taking from America's perspective? Or is it better to provide more of these GBU-28s to Israel and allow them to drill effectively and just gradually work away until they do destroy that target? That'll be part of the conversation that's going on at the moment. It's very difficult to call. My instinct says that President Trump is very much against war. He got elected on a backdrop of saying he'd end the war in Ukraine in a day and that he'd solve the Middle East crisis. I suspect his natural instinct will not be to try to press the button and get America involved in another war.
If you were Trump's national security advisor, what would you advise him regarding this situation?
I think that part of this is a regional issue, because it links to a question you asked just now about regime change. Prime Minister Netanyahu's been hinting at that. But the reality is that whilst Iran is sort of the black sheep of the Islamic world, I suspect that many of the leading countries, Saudi Arabia and others, will not be that upset if Iran is stopped from having a nuclear weapon. But if the rhetoric changes, if this becomes about regime change, all of a sudden the Arab world will be a lot less comfortable with that approach. They don't want to see another Arab Spring. There are very few democracies in that part of the world. As a result, that might scare some of the senior members of the Arab world, and therefore Prime Minister Netanyahu would lose support in a heartbeat. As a result of that, I think it's very, very likely America will discuss any of these options with particularly Saudi Arabia to find out whether the benefit, which is guaranteeing the destruction of Iran's nuclear program, outweighs the sensitivities of America getting directly involved. And if America was to get a green light from other Middle East countries, I suspect that might be enough. But again, we're talking about some very sensitive conversations behind closed doors, and that's whether or not President Trump's got the appetite for that.
However, it seems like the US would have the upper hand if it would join Israel right now and will bomb this nuclear sites, because Iran is weak right now, and many military experts and also, for example, Senator Lindsey Graham says that now is a great window of opportunity for the US to finally destroy Iranian nuclear program while Iran is weak and vulnerable after these devastating blows from Israel.
No, I agree, and that's the difficult thing. But it's one thing being frustrated at Iran's continued progress towards a nuclear weapon. It's quite another to go in and attack Iran for developing a nuclear weapon. I mean, I do think there's some interesting intellectual problems around this. You know, nuclear weapons were conceived back at the sort of end of the Second World War, but there's been a very limited number of countries that have actually developed them into a full-scale capability. And, you know, let's go back to the Budapest memo. If Ukraine had not given up its nuclear weapons, would Russia have invaded? it's a rhetorical question, but they do remain the sort of ultimate guarantor of peace and security. Therefore, Iran has always argued that, it needs to have nuclear weapons to guarantee its safety. Now, I understand fully why America and others would decide that that was not going to be tolerable. But even so, it's a big step to go in and actually start to take out all the Iranian facilities. And I do think here we're talking about, can you destroy Hamas? The answer is no. Can you degrade it? Yes. Can you destroy Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons? No. Can you degrade it and put that program back decades? Yes. And I think the analysis will be all about how much has the recent attacks delayed, deferred Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons. And if that's measured in decades rather than months, then eventually somebody will call a halt and resume diplomatic talks. But I do think Prime Minister Netanyahu sees this as a once-in-a-generation window of opportunity to finally destroy Iran's capability, and I don't see him stopping until that's finished.
Thank you, Sean, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraine.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.